author, linguist, teacher, and crucial
I met Noam
social
Chomsky.
critic, Professor Noam Chomsky.
Needs a little introduction.
And he said,
to go through the ritual.
ever trust the state.
Our speaker tonight is Noam Chomsky. Perhaps you've heard of him.
We make a very serious error, in my opinion, when we tend to focus on one region of the world. So, if people are interested in Southeast Asia, they look at Southeast Asia. If they're interested in the Middle East, they look at the Middle East. That's overlooking the fact that the U.S. is a global power. And what it's doing in one place, it's usually doing in another place because they grow out of the same basic principles. And the case of the Middle East is not an exception. You want to understand what's going on, you have to look at it in a much more global framework, focusing attention on planning in Washington, which, since the Second World War, has dominated most of the world. The perpetrators, I assume, like everyone else, are probably Al-Qaeda or some group very much like them. And as for their motivations, I think we have a good understanding. They've been very clear about it for 20 years. Not these same individuals, but others like them. And their words correspond to their actions, so there's every reason to take them seriously. Nobody knows them better than the CIA because it helped organize and recruit them and arm them and train them, dealt with them for years. In fact, the same special forces that are chasing them around the caves in Afghanistan are the ones that trained them in the 1980s, so I'm sure they know all about them. And they've been very clear about what their intentions are. Bin Laden is the most eloquent spokesperson, and what he's been saying for years is we're going to drive the infidels out of the Muslim lands, and we're going to turn these lands into what we call pure Islamic states. So our main enemy is Saudi Arabia, because they're not a pure Islamic state, and the other corrupt and brutal states of the region. They were, of course, opposed to the Russians, who, as far as they're concerned, are indistinguishable from the Americans, just more infidels in Muslim lands. As for the Americans, they turned against the United States when, from their perspective, the United States was occupying Muslim lands by putting permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia, which is much more important to them than Afghanistan. And that's been a consistent position for a long time, 20 years. I mean, their first terrorist act was assassination of President Sadat back in 1981. Notice not the same individuals, but the same sort of networks and groups. So that's what they've been saying, and that's what they've been doing. I have every reason to take it seriously. They tried to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. That was a very ambitious plan. They were planning to blow up the World Trade Center, the UN, the FBI building, the tunnels into New York. That one, they were caught in time. If you can believe the U.S. police criminal system, the perpetrators are in jail. One of them is a Muslim cleric who was incidentally brought into the United States over the objections of the Immigration and Nationalization Service by the CIA, by CIA intervention, because he was a friend of theirs and they wanted him here. And when he was here, he organized terrorist cells which tried to blow up the World Trade Center. So those people, Sheikh Rahman is not the same as Bin Laden, but there's a kind of community of similarity. And there's shared conception. So I assume that's the perpetrators. And I agree with the world's intelligence systems that those are their reasons, and doesn't seem much doubt about that. Then comes the second question. What about the reservoir of sympathy and sometimes support, at least acceptance of many of their alleged goals? So that's the whole region. Why is there hatred against us there? George Bush's famous question. Well, everyone knows the answer to this. A couple of days after I have to distinguish two things here. There's a category of people called intellectuals. Their task is to make up fabrications that protect power and divert attention from what's obvious and indoctrinate people and so on. And they've concocted all sorts of complicated stories about globalization and, failure to enter the modern world and this, that, and the other thing. Okay, and they envy us because we're so wonderful, et cetera, et cetera. All right, we can put all that aside. That's standard propaganda. Let's talk about what is plainly the case and is in fact discussed by serious people, like, say, the Wall Street Journal. So a few days after the September 11th, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, began running serious stories in which they investigated opinions of people in the Islamic world who they're interested in, what they called moneyed Muslims, the ones with, the rich ones, the important ones. So bankers, international lawyers, directors of multinational corporations, people who are right inside the U.S. system who certainly have no opposition to what's called globalization. In fact, they're part of it, who certainly hate bin Laden because he's trying to kill them, but who nevertheless agree with much of what he says. And what they say is, their opinions are that the United States supports brutal and corrupt regimes which block democracy and modernization and development. They oppose particular policies like the decisive U.S. support for the 35-year military occupation of Palestinian territory, which has been harsh and brutal and relies crucially on U.S. military and diplomatic support. When you read in the newspapers that Israeli helicopters and jets are attacking Palestinians, that's total fabrication. U.S. jets and U.S. helicopters, which happen to be piloted by Israeli pilots, are attacking those concentrations. That's what ought to be said. Israel doesn't manufacture helicopters or F-16s, and they understand all that. They know that the U.S. has been blocking any diplomatic settlement for 30 years, since Sadat offered one in 1971. It's not reported here, and in the West it's not talked about much, but they know it. And they know what's going on there. They also know perfectly well that the U.S. and Britain are carrying out operations against Iraq, which are devastating the civilian society and strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they also remember, as Westerners like to forget, that the U.S. has and Britain and France and Holland and so on have no objection to Saddam Hussein's crimes. We know that for sure, because they supported Saddam Hussein right through the period of his worst crimes. Gassing the Kurds, Anfal, chemical weapons. They continued to support him very happily. He remained a good, favored friend and ally of the West, which helped provide him with the means for developing weapons of mass destruction when he was really dangerous. So they listened when Tony Blair and Madeleine Albright condemned Saddam because, the ultimate monster even gassed his own people. They listen, but they add the words that are excluded in the West. They say, yeah, he committed those crimes with your support. Okay, rather crucial omission, which you never hear from Tony Blair and the rest. But they are not that indoctrinated, so they remember those elementary truths. And those are other reasons why, if you want, there's hatred against us. Furthermore, there's absolutely nothing new about this. Anybody who wants to understand any of it knows exactly where to go. You go to the declassified U.S. record. U.S. is a very open society. We have declassified records of internal deliberations from the past. All these questions came up decades ago. So and had the same answers. In 1958, crucial year for many reasons. I'm now talking about internal records. The U.S., so the Eisenhower administration, discussed three major crises for the United States. One was Indonesia, one was North Africa, third was the Middle East. All Islamic countries, all oil producers, The question arose whether the Russians were involved. That was dismissed as ludicrous, no Russian involvement. It's just independent nationalism in the three countries, which was the main crisis. Then Eisenhower pointed out, with regard to the Middle East, in his words approximately, he said there is a campaign of hatred against us, not by the governments, but by the people. And that was an issue that was discussed. No globalization, no, they hate us because we have McDonald's and none of this stuff. Why is there a campaign of hatred against us? Well, the National Security Council discussed it. That's the highest analysis and planning body. And they said the problem is that there's a perception among the people of the region that the United States supports corrupt and harsh regimes which prevent democratization and development, and does so because of its interest in controlling Near East oil. And they said it's hard to counter this perception because it's true. And furthermore, it should be true, because we should support those regimes in order to maintain our control over Near East oil. So therefore, there is a campaign of hatred against us by the people who see that we're robbing their resources and preventing democracy and development. But, we can't do much about it because that's what we ought to be doing. Like I say, no McDonald's, no envying us our magnificence, no globalization, just perfectly obvious things. The same reason why there was a campaign of hatred against England from the people of India, or against Holland from the people of the East Indies, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you crush people under your boot, they don't like it. So there's a campaign of hatred against it. In fact, what they were discussing internally in 1958 is the same as what the Wall Street Journal found in 2001, and for the same reasons, because the policies haven't fundamentally changed. So we understand. The Wall Street Journal only was concerned with elite opinion. If they'd gone down to the slums of Cairo, they would have gotten stronger opinions, but of the same kind, and more different ones also. Because in the slums of Cairo, they wouldn't like the fact that the wealth of the region is going to the West and not to the people of the region. The ones who the Wall Street Journal was talking about are quite happy about that, because they're part of the ruling elite and they enrich themselves while the resources go to the West. So they're part of the imperial system. So you get different opinions if you bother to ask people in the so-called streets. But fundamentally, it's the same. So there's a So bin Laden's messages certainly resonate, and people agree with a lot of the things he's saying. About 80% of Egyptians, for example, say that the most important issue to them is the crushing of the Palestinians. So when they hear bin Laden say it, they agree. There's nothing to do with whether they like him or hate him. On the other hand, there is a clique of radical Islamists who were organized and trained and brought together by Western intelligence for their own purposes, and have continued to do for 20 years just what they've always said they were going to do. So while some things are obscure, I don't think these are obscure. I think the answers are quite transparent. The proper topic for an occasion like this, I suppose, is pretty obvious. It would be the question of how the media have handled the major story of the past months. And there's no question about what that is. That the issue is the war on terrorism, so-called, and specifically in the Islamic world. Incidentally, by media here, I intend the term to be understood pretty broadly, so including journals of commentary, analysis, opinion, in fact, the intellectual culture generally. It's a really important topic. It's been reviewed regularly by FAIR, by others. However, it isn't really an appropriate topic for a talk. And the reason is that it requires too much detailed analysis. So what I'd like to do is take a somewhat different approach to it and ask the question, how should the story be handled in accord with general principles that are accepted as guidelines, so principles of fairness and accuracy and relevance and so on. Let's approach this by kind of a thought experiment. Imagine an intelligent Martian. Incidentally, I'm told that by convention Martians are male, so I'll refer to it as he. So suppose that this Martian went to Harvard and Columbia Journalism School and learned all sorts of high-minded things and actually believes them. How would the Martian handle a story like this? Well, I think he would begin with some factual observations that he'd send back to the journal on Mars. One factual observation is that the war on terrorism was not declared on September 11th. Rather, it was redeclared using the same rhetoric as the first declaration 20 years earlier. The Reagan administration, as you know, I'm sure, came into office announcing that a war on terrorism would be the core of U.S. foreign policy, and it condemned what the president called the evil scourge of terrorism. The main focus was state-supported international terrorism in the Islamic world, and at that time also in Central America. International terrorism was described as a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself in a return to barbarism in the modern age. Actually, I'm quoting the administration moderate, Secretary of State George Shultz. Reagan's the phrase I quoted from Reagan actually had to do with the Middle East, terrorism in the Middle East, and it was in the year 1955. That was the year in which international terrorism in that region was selected by editors as the lead story of the year in an annual AP poll. So, point one that our Martian would report is that the year 2001 is the second time that this has been the main lead story, and that the war on terrorism has been redeclared pretty much as before. Furthermore, there's a striking continuity. The same people are in leading positions. So Donald Rumsfeld, who's running the military component of the second phase of the war on terrorism, he was Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East during the first phase of the war on terrorism, including the peak year, 1985. The person who was just appointed a couple months ago to be in charge of the diplomatic component of the war at the United Nations is John Negroponte, who during the first phase was supervising U.S. operations in Honduras, which was the main base for the U.S. war against terror in the first phase. Current history has an issue on terrorism with various scholars. Every single one of them talks about the motivations. Did they condemn them? No. What they're condemning is critics. They say critics should not be allowed to raise questions. The reason? We have to silence criticism because everyone has to line up and sing hosannas to our leaders. That's the job of intellectuals. Round up the chorus so they all sing praises to your leaders while they march in the parade and tell you how magnificent we are. I mean, that's the historic task of intellectuals, not just here. I mean, it's a historic task. I mean, let's go back, say, to World War I, far enough away so we can think about it. What did intellectuals do during World War I? Well, first thing that happened is 93 leading German intellectuals published a manifesto calling on their colleagues in the rest of the world to support Germany in its magnificent aim to bring justice and peace to the world. What did the American intellectuals do? Exactly the same thing. In fact, they all lauded the magnificence of their own leaders, There were some exceptions. Most of them end up in jail on both sides. So in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht objected and were in jail. In England, Bertrand Russell objected. He was in jail. In the United States, Eugene Debs is the leading figure in U.S. labor in the 20th century and a socialist presidential candidate. He went to jail for raising mild questions about Woodrow Wilson's war. And others were just repressed, like Randolph Bourne was kicked out of all of his journals and so on, because they didn't join the parade, and intellectuals are supposed to join the parade, and they do. Exceptions are so rare, you can practically list them. There are exceptions, and there are honorable ones. Actually, most of them are in the third world. I'll give you quite a few. But in the West, most intellectuals are very loyal and submissive. And what you're hearing is not, don't talk about motivations, because they're very selective, as I say. Wall Street Journal is okay. Current History is okay. The Yale University volume on Age of Terror is okay. It's critics who are not allowed to raise motivations because critics are not allowed to exist. Okay. So therefore they're not allowed to do what other people do, or in fact do anything. They have to join the parade. We've passed the point where you throw them into jail in the West, but you try to get rid of them in other ways, by vilification, by lies, by defamation, the various techniques that intellectuals know very well. It's part of their métier. So that's what you're hearing. And you can see that you're hearing that by the selectivity. So we don't have to bother with the argument because it's idiotic. Of course, if you're serious, you're going to try to find out the motivation of the Nazis too. Anybody who's serious about Nazism, of course, is going to ask about the motivation. It's not even a question. Is that justification of them? Of course not. It's just elementary rationality. A good Martian reporter would also want to clarify a couple of basic ideas. First of all, he'd like to know what exactly is terrorism, and secondly, what's the proper response to it? Well, whatever the answer to the second question is, that proper response must satisfy some moral truisms, and the Martian can easily discover what these truisms are, at least as understood by the leaders of the war, the self-declared war on terrorism, because they tell us constantly that they're very pious Christians who therefore revere the Gospels and have certainly memorized the definition of hypocrite given prominently in the Gospels. Namely, the hypocrites are those who apply to others standards that they refuse to accept for themselves. So the Martian understands then that in order to rise to the absolutely minimal moral level, we have to agree and in fact insist that if some act is right for us, then it's right for others, and if it's wrong when others do it, then it's wrong when we do it. That's the most elementary of moral truisms, and once the Martian realizes that, he can pack up his bags and go back to Mars because his research task is over. He would be unlikely to find a single phrase in the vast coverage and commentary about the war on terrorism that even begins to approach this minimal standard. Don't take my word for it. Try the experiment. Well, I don't want to exaggerate. You can probably find the phrase now and then way out at the margins, though very rarely. Nevertheless, this moral truism is recognized within the mainstream. It's understood to be an extremely dangerous heresy, and therefore it's necessary to erect impregnable barriers against it, even before anybody exhibits it, even though it's so rare. In fact, there's even a technical vocabulary available in case anybody would dare to engage in the heresy, to involve themselves in the heresy that we should abide by moral truisms that we pretend to revere. The offenders are guilty of something called moral relativism. That means the suggestion that we apply to ourselves the standards we apply to others, or maybe moral equivalence. That's a term which was invented, I think, by Jean Kirkpatrick to ward off the danger that somebody might dare to look at our own crimes. Or the term, or maybe they can be called involved. They're carrying out the crime of America bashing, or they're anti-Americans, which is a rather interesting concept. As far as I'm aware, the term is used elsewhere only in totalitarian states. For example, in Russia in the old days, where anti-Sovietism was the highest crime. If somebody were to publish a book in Italy, say, called The Anti-Italians, you can imagine what the reaction would be in the streets of Milan and Rome, or in any country where freedom and democracy are taken seriously. But let's suppose that the Martian isn't deterred by the inevitable tirades and stream of vilification, and suppose he persists in keeping to the most elementary moral truisms. Well, as I said, if he does that, he can just go home. But suppose out of curiosity, he decides to stay on and look a little bit further. So what'll happen? Well, back to the question, what is terrorism? Important one. Now, there's a proper course for a serious Martian reporter to follow to find the answer to that, look at the people who declare the war on terrorism and see what they say terrorism is. It's fair enough. And there is, in fact, an official definition in the U.S. Code and Army manuals elsewhere. It's defined briefly, terrorism, as I'm quoting, is defined as the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear. Well, that sounds simple. As far as I can see, it's appropriate. But we constantly read that the problem of defining terrorism is very vexing and complex. And the Martian might wonder why that's true. Of course, the same is true for those who are victims of vastly worse terrorist crimes, but that's reported only on Mars. So you might try to find a report, say, of a conference run by Salvadoran Jesuits a couple of years ago. The Jesuits, their experiences under U.S. international terrorism were particularly grisly. The conference report stressed the residual effect of what it called the culture of terrorism, which domesticates the aspirations of the majority, who realize that they must submit to the dictates of the ruling terrorist state and its local agents, or they'll again be returned to the Central American mode as recommended by the doves at the peak of the state-supported international terrorism of the 80s. Unreported here, of course, maybe headlines on Mars. Forgetting everything that's been said, rising to minimal levels of morality, let's try to answer the question. Well, we can start by asking how should a long series of countries around the world react to Western state terrorism? So to take one uncontroversial case. How should Nicaragua react to U.S. terrorism against Nicaragua? I mean, that case is uncontroversial because we have a World Court decision, and we would have had a Security Council resolution except that the U.S. vetoed it. So it's uncontroversial. And it's much worse than September 11th. Tens of thousands of people killed, country practically destroyed, may never recover. So how should Nicaragua have responded to U.S. terror? Well, one possibility is to bomb Washington. Does anybody believe that's the way they should have responded? Another might be, say, bioterror. Another may be assassinate the president. Anybody believe that that's a proper response? I mean, I've never seen anybody who believes it. I certainly don't believe it. Okay, but if we don't believe that that was a right response to our atrocities, then it's not the right response to their atrocities, particularly when it's people who didn't even do it, like the people in Afghanistan had nothing to do with this. So the real question is, should Nicaragua have set off bombs in, I don't know, Oklahoma or something? It was ridiculous. So therefore, the entire Western response, by Western standards, is totally illegitimate. In fact, let's take contemporary terrorism. Plenty of it. I mean, September 11th was a terrorist atrocity. So is the reaction to it. Literally, by the literal meaning of the word terrorism as defined in U.S. official documents. Terrorism is the calculated threat or use of violence to achieve political or other ends through intimidation or fear. All right. Suppose you announce to people, we're going to continue to bomb you unless you turn over to us people who we suspect of crimes, though we're not going to provide you with any evidence and we're going to refuse negotiations. I'm quoting George Bush. That's terrorism in the literal sense, extreme terrorism. Or let's go on a few weeks later, end of October, the U.S. and Britain changed their war aims. They shifted it to overthrowing the regime. So Admiral Boyce, the British Minister of Defense, announced to the people of Afghanistan, you have to understand that we're going to continue to bomb you until you get your leadership changed. Textbook illustration of terrorism. Okay, what's the right response? Is it to assassinate Bush and Boyce? To bomb the United States and England? No, it's not. So any of the responses that are taken are obviously illegitimate, at least if we rise to minimal moral levels. Well, how do you deal with it? Well, actually, there are proposals that make some sense, like the Vatican, those radicals in the Vatican. Or take, say, Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal. In the current issue, it happens to have published an article which was actually written in October by Michael Howard, who's the preeminent Anglo-American military historian. He's got all the right credentials, very supportive of the British Empire, thinks the American Empire is even more wonderful, so perfect person. And a major military historian. What he says is, in the case of a criminal conspiracy, which is what this obviously was, the right approach is to carry out careful police investigation, find evidence as to who the perpetrators were. If it's international and you have the evidence, go to an appropriate international authority, which could be, say, the Security Council, under their authorization, carry out actions, if they won't turn them over to you, which they might have, under their authorization, carry out actions to find and apprehend the perpetrators, bring them to an international tribunal where they can get a fair trial. Okay? Well, that's an approach. And in fact, if we take that approach seriously, we would do the same thing to Admiral Boyce, Tony Blair, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush the First, and anyone else. The people who are running the current war on terrorism, like Donald Rumsfeld, who was Ronald Reagan's special advisor to the Middle East when they were terrorizing the whole region. John Negroponte, who's running the diplomatic side of the current war on terrorism, and was the proconsul in Honduras, organizing the Contra armies attacking Nicaragua, for which the U.S. was condemned by the World Court. Yeah, right down the list. We would do the same thing to them. That's assuming that we could reach minimal levels of moral integrity. And of course, all of this is so remote from anything that you can even talk about in the West that it's hard to say the words. But then there's an elementary conclusion that follows from that. Everyone in the West, and I have to include myself here because I don't propose this either, everyone in the West is such a total hypocrite that for them even to talk about questions of right or wrong is a disgrace. Well, suppose finally that we join the Martian Observer. I'm skipping a lot of things I think are interesting. You can ask about them if you like. But suppose finally that we join the Martian Observer and we depart from convention radically. We accept moral truisms. If we can rise to that level, we can then, and only then, honestly raise the question of how to respond to terrorist crimes. One answer is to follow the precedent of law-abiding states, the Nicaraguan precedent, for example. Of course, that failed because they ran up against the fact that the world is ruled by force, not by law, but wouldn't fail for the U.S. However, evidently that's excluded. I have yet to see one phrase referring to that precedent in the massive coverage of the last couple of months. Another answer was given by Bush and Boyce, but we instantly reject that one because nobody believes that Haiti or Nicaragua or Cuba and a long list of others around the world have the right to carry out massive terrorist attacks against the United States and its clients or other rich and powerful states. A more reasonable answer was given by from a number of sources, including the Vatican, and was spelled out by the preeminent Anglo-American military historian Michael Howard last October. Actually, it's published in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. That's the leading establishment journal. Howard has all the appropriate credentials, a lot of prestige. He's a great admirer of the British Empire, even more extravagantly of its successor in global rule, so he can't be accused of moral relativism or other such crimes. Referring to September 11th, he recommended then a police operation against a criminal conspiracy whose members should be hunted down and brought before an international court where they could receive a fair trial and, if found guilty, be awarded an appropriate sentence. Well, that was never contemplated, of course, but sounds kind of reasonable to me. If it is reasonable, then it ought to hold for even worse terrorist crimes. For example, the U.S. International terrorist attack against Nicaragua, or even worse ones nearby and elsewhere, going up right to the present, incidentally. Well, that could never be contemplated, of course, but for opposite reasons. So honesty leaves us with a dilemma. The easy answer is conventional hypocrisy. The other option is the one adopted by our Martian friend, who actually abides by the principles that we profess with grand self-righteousness. That option is harder to consider, but imperative if the world is to be spared still worse disasters. Thanks. Immediately after the September 11th atrocities, one thing was obvious. I mean, I don't say it in retrospect. I said it the first time I was asked a question by reporters on September 12th. It's in print. What was obvious was that every harsh and repressive force in the world would see this as a window of opportunity to pursue their own agenda more relentlessly, while people are either frightened or distracted or suppressed by obedience or something. And that's happened all over the world. I mean, exactly how they did it depended on the country. So in Russia, the way they did it was by intensifying their atrocities in Chechnya, assuming correctly that the West would let them off the hook. So Germany would say, well, not so bad, and the United States would kind of help them out in Georgia and so on. Israel did it by sharply intensifying repression in the territory. Turkey did it by starting a wave of repression against intellectuals and others. Actually, I was just there for a political trial, which is one of those cases. And so India did it by making its repression harsher in Kashmir. The more democratic countries did it by various devices they call prevention of terrorism acts, which have nothing to do with terrorism, but have a lot to do with making the population more submissive and obedient and silent and marginal while they push through their own agendas. And their own agendas are the old ones, but now they have an opportunity. So for the Bush administration, it's important to cut capital gains taxes and taxes for the wealthy, so that you transfer wealth even more to a narrow sector of rich and powerful, to push through international economic agreements that they know the public's opposed to and can't manage when the people are looking, to destroy the environment in which our grandchildren might survive, to vastly increase military programs, which include really dangerous ones like militarization of space. And incidentally, this is not the military-industrial complex. That's a misnomer. High-tech industry generally exists under the cover of public subsidies that come largely through the military system. Everyone at the institution you're now in knows this because it pays their salaries. My salary, for example. MIT is one of the funnels by which the public is deluded into paying the costs of high-tech industry. Almost the entire so-called new economy relies on this. They now can do it under the fear of terror. So in the last couple of years, there's been a very sharp increase in public expenditures at the National Institute of Health and so on for the biology-based sciences. Reason, that's the cutting edge of the new economy. For the future, it's going to be biology-based, so you have to enrich pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies and so on, and they don't want to pay for it. They want the public to pay for it. Now it can be done under the cover of bioterrorism, so there'll be another big increase, to another big public subsidy to biology-based corporations under the cover of bioterrorism. So it's not the military, there is no military-industrial complex. It's just the industrial system operating under one or another pretext. Defense was a pretext for a long time. So yeah, they try to ram that through, and many other policies which are extremely harmful to the general public. I mean, it probably will devastate what limited social support systems there are, like Medicare, Social Security, and so on. In fact, it's happening right at the moment. Like just yesterday, Bush announced the high tariffs for steel, right? But with a couple of little provisos. There is nothing in them for the steel workers who are thrown out when corporations declare bankruptcy and their stockholders and CEOs go off and enjoy themselves with tons of money. The steel workers lose not only their jobs, but their pensions, their health care, their benefits, and nothing goes to them. And the same is true of everything else. Take a look at it. There's a sharp assault against the population and against democracy under the cover of you got to be patriotic while I relentlessly pursue my own objectives. So you shut up and I'll be more energetic than I was before. Yeah, of course they're trying that. And it's the same in every country. So yes, here and everywhere else, the window of opportunity was perceived and is being used. Let me personalize it against Jews. I mean, when I grew up as a kid, we were Jewish, anti-Semitism was a very, very visible phenomenon. I mean, I grew up in a part of a lower middle class section of a city where we happened to be the only Jewish family in an Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, which were mostly Nazis, pro-Nazi, pretty openly. And, I grew up with a visceral fear of Catholics. It wasn't until I was an adult that I could deal with Catholics and somehow not be afraid. It wasn't much fun, And when they came out of that Jesuit school, they were frightening creatures. Furthermore, when my father finally got enough money to get a second-hand car and we could drive around a little, if we'd get to the nearby mountains, we'd have to look for a motel because a lot of motels had on them restricted. That means no Jews, When I got to Harvard in 1950, the anti-Semitism was so thick you could cut it with a knife. In fact, one of the reasons MIT here is a great university is because a lot of first-rate people like Paul Samuelson and Norbert Wiener couldn't get jobs at Harvard because they were Jewish. In fact, Harvard got their first Jewish mathematician, it's a Jewish field, while I was there, 1953, because the department was so anti-Semitic. I mean, this all changed in the 50s, but up until that time, anti-Semitism was perfectly overt and very real. And the Jewish community was subdued. You didn't want to be too visible, because you got enough problems. It's one of the reasons why refugees from the Holocaust didn't come here. Almost anybody in Europe, certainly people in the DP camps, would have been delighted to come to the United States. They didn't. Refugees from the people who were dying in the DP camps after After the Germans were defeated, they were still there, and it wasn't very nice. In fact, it hadn't changed much, except the crematoria weren't going. Very few of them came to the United States, partly because of anti-Semitism, partly because the Jewish community didn't want them, didn't push to bring them here, and for reasons that are, not pretty, but are understandable. And we've got enough problems. The anti-Semitism is no longer a legitimate form of racism. Anti-Arab bias is a legitimate form of racism, meaning you don't have to hide it. Okay, most forms of racism, you have to pretend you're not a racist. So you have to pretend I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not anti-black. You may be, but you don't advertise it. Anti-Arab racism, you're allowed to advertise. This is way before September 11th. And the community, you see it in films and books and attitudes. It's just not even hidden, I mean, nobody will come out and say, I'm an anti-Arab racist, but it's it's everywhere. And every Muslim or Arab in the country knows it. Okay. Now, after September 11th, I should add that this shows up in behavior too. So just to give you an illustration, Boston happens to have a big Lebanese community. And while they're not super wealthy, they have money. They're storekeepers and businessmen and so on. In 1982, at the time of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which was a total horrible atrocity, a few of us made an effort to organize just a charitable relief program for people in Lebanon. We could not get any support from the Lebanese community here. And I think I understand why, because I remember it from childhood. I think they just don't want to be too visible. And I think that's understandable. I can't prove that, but that's the sense that I had. And it's not just, since September 11th, it's increased, but not only Arabs, I mean anybody who looks a little bit dark. I mean, look, Europe was the most savage part of the world for 500 years. And part of the reason Europe conquered the world is that it had a culture of savagery that was beyond anything that anyone saw anywhere else. That's why small European armies could conquer, big groups. Partly they were ahead in the technology of war, but partly it was just the culture. In fact, you look at military historians, what they say is in the rest of the world, war was a sport. In Europe, it was a science. In fact, Europeans for centuries, their prime concern was to slaughter one another. That was part of the imposition of the nation-state system in Europe. It's a brutal, murderous system. Everywhere it's been imposed, it's been a disaster. It took centuries to impose it in Europe, and it's centuries of savagery. I mean, it's not just the 20th century. I mean, one 17th century war wiped out about a third or 40% of the population of Germany. It's an extremely savage civilization. It expended its atrocities all over the world, and if anyone resisted elsewhere, they went berserk. I mean, when there was an Indian rebellion called in England they call it the Indian Mutiny. There was a rebellion of Indians in 1857. The British went totally berserk. I mean, they practically wiped the place out, it was supported. I mean, there was some criticism in England, but most of the intellectuals supported it. And the same elsewhere. You just don't harm Europeans when they kill you in your country. It's not allowed. Boxer Rebellion was a case in point too. I mean, the West went berserk. Chinese were defending themselves. I mean, they committed atrocities. Everybody commits atrocities. But the atrocities were in their countries. They weren't in England or Holland or Germany, Belgium. They were there, and they had to be slaughtered there. What's different about September 11th is, for the first time in history, the atrocities took place in Europe and its offshoots. September 11th was a horrible atrocity, but it wasn't new. There are plenty of atrocities like that. It's only that they take place somewhere else. This is the history of Europe for hundreds of years. We commit those atrocities regularly, and much worse ones, against other people, but they don't do anything to us. There's nothing in the history of Europe and its offshoots, like the United States, in which there were cases where Europeans were killed, and there were atrocities against Europeans, but they were in other countries, not at home. With very marginal exceptions, the conquerors of the world were immune. September 11th destroyed that total immunity, destroyed the total monopoly on violence. The overwhelming predominance, of course, remains, but not the monopoly, which is why it's so shocking. Well, let me turn to my main topic, our role and responsibility. By our, here I mean people who are citizens of the United States and share responsibility for what it's doing and should be asking what they can do to overcome the crimes that the U.S. is supporting. In many countries, Israel's only one. I've happened to have just come back from Colombia and Turkey, some of the worst human rights violators in the world. The situation there is far worse, even in the occupied territories. And I talked about these things there, and as I do here. And people often object that it's unfair to criticize them. They point out that they themselves are living under terrorist threat. And in Colombia and Turkey, there's no doubt that that's been true far more than in Israel. And they say, therefore, it's unfair to criticize them. What they say is in part correct. Nothing justifies the terrorist atrocities that they carry out, which are horrifying. But it's true that the criticism ought to be directed here. They are all acting with decisive U.S. support, military aid and support, diplomatic support, ideological support, which means covering up what happened or giving apologetics for it. And the United States, as essentially the ruler of the world, sets the limits within which they can operate. And they'll go to the limits. Almost any country would when authorized by the chief mafia don. And it's therefore at home that to ourselves that the criticism should be directed if we're honest about it. I am, actually, more than in the past. There are a lot of good things happening. And it's very striking how they cannot be perceived. So, for example, the New York Times business pages a couple of days ago had an article on Anderson, the company that's caught up in the security scam. And it mentioned in it that all of this falls under the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS. And then it said, interesting comment, it said no one has objected to GATS, although there has been a lot of protest against merchandise trade. Well, in fact, GATS has been the leading theme of protest of the popular movements for years. So a major topic in Porto Alegre this year and the year before. It was a major topic at the protests against the Summit of the Americas in Quebec in April. It's been a topic in all the forums for a very good reason. It's a horrifying attack on democracy, and the public knows it. The correspondent is not lying. That's what he reads in his own journals. That's what he hears from his friends in the elegant restaurants that he goes to, or the faculty clubs, or the editorial offices. So in this little cocoon, yeah, that's probably the way it is. And there's a principle of the press. Principle is rigid. You cannot report what protesters are saying. The only thing you can report is if you can find somebody throwing a rock somewhere. You can report that. But you can't report what they're saying. And therefore, if it happens that what they're having is extensive discussions about GATS, you won't know. So he's telling the truth from his point of view. And within the cocoon of intellectual life, that's what the world looks like. I mean, that's why you see headlines saying there's no dissent in the United States. It's not like the Vietnam War. It's precisely the opposite, dramatically. I mean, during the Vietnam War, the war went on for years before there was any protest at all. I mean, it's 40 years ago that Kennedy attacked South Vietnam. It took years before you could even have the minimal protest. Now, thousands of people at meetings and demonstrations. I go home tonight and spend an hour, as I do every night, just turning down invitations. because it's way beyond what it's ever been before. But you can't know that within the cocoon. And you can't let other people know it either. You have to make them think they're alone and isolated.
Inside the system that you change it? By having people elected? By having people elected?
Well, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, if you can get a senator who's a nice guy, that's better than having a senator who's a rotten guy. But there are very sharp limits on what you can do. I mean, these are institutional facts. I mean, like, say, take a corporation. I mean, suppose the chairman of Ford decided to cut back profits and to use them to improve working conditions and to make safer cars and, put resources into, 10 cars 10 years from now that won't wreck the environment and so on. What'll happen to him? Well, for one thing, he probably ought to be put in jail because it's illegal. He has a legal responsibility to maximize profit and market share for his shareholders. Well, he wouldn't be put in jail, but he'd surely be kicked out. And somebody else would replace him who would do the right thing. And in fact, if by some miracle he did do what he set out to do, he'd be out of business in a year because his competitors wouldn't be doing it, so they'd be underselling him next year. I mean, these are institutional facts. I mean, the individuals in charge may be, very nice to their children and friends and give a lot of money to charity, but it doesn't change anything because they have to act within an institutional framework which requires vicious activity. You're head of a corporation, you've got to be an immoral monster, otherwise you can't survive as the head of a corporation. If you're part of a state system, you're part of the mafia. And the international affairs runs like the mafia. It's power systems that get away with whatever they can. The United States is more violent because it's more powerful. And if Andorra had U.S. military force, they'd be doing it. That happens to be the fact about the way the world is. Well, the world can change, and it has changed. So, for example, no American president now could even dream of doing what John F. Kennedy did 40 years ago. 40 years ago, John F. Kennedy started the bombing of South Vietnam, the use of chemical warfare. People are dying still from it, driving millions of people into concentration camps. There wasn't a peep. You couldn't get two people to talk about it. It was years before you could even have a public meeting about it. That's inconceivable today. The country's gotten a lot more civilized. And not because, the president's got more civilized. It's because of the popular movements. A lot of ferment in the 60s, developed much more in the 70s and the 80s, and just changed the culture. And that's the way to change things.